I served God for 40 years, until my pastor said, "You don't belong here," in front of the whole congregation. The words hung in the air of Grace Community Church like a death sentence. 200 faces turned toward me, their expressions ranging from shock to vindication, from pity to barely concealed satisfaction. I stood there in the third pew from the front, the same pew where I had sat every Sunday for 4 decades, and felt my life crumbling around me like ancient paper. My name is Marco Stevenson, and I am 63 years old. Or perhaps I should say I was Marco Stevenson, because the man I had been died that Sunday morning in October, standing in a church that had been my home, facing a pastor I had trusted, surrounded by people I had called family. But I am getting ahead of myself. Every story has a beginning, and mine started long before that devastating Sunday. It started in a small apartment in Newark, New Jersey, where a young man of 23 knelt beside his bed and prayed for the first time in his life. That young man was broken. He had just lost his job, his girlfriend had left him, and his father had died without ever telling him he was proud of him. He had been raised Catholic, but hadn't set foot in a church since his confirmation. Yet that night, desperate and alone, he found himself on his knees, whispering into the darkness, "If you're real, if you're listening, please help me." 3 days later, I walked into Grace Community Church. It was a Wednesday evening, and I had been wandering the streets, unable to face my empty apartment. The doors were open, and warm light spilled out onto the sidewalk. I heard singing, not the formal hymns of my childhood, but something joyful and alive. Without thinking, I walked inside. Pastor William Morrison was young then, only 35, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to look right into your soul. After the service, he found me sitting alone in the back row and sat down beside me. He didn't ask why I was crying. He simply placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "God sees you. He knows where you are. And He hasn't given up on you." I had never experienced such immediate acceptance, such unconditional welcome. Pastor Morrison invited me to a Bible study, introduced me to other young men in the church, and within months, I felt like I belonged somewhere for the first time in my life. Grace Community became my family. Over the next 5 years, I transformed. I got a job at a printing company, worked my way up to supervisor, and started volunteering at the church. I led the youth group, organized mission trips, and spent my Saturday mornings maintaining the building and grounds. When Pastor Morrison needed someone to manage the church finances, he asked me. When we needed a new roof, I rallied the congregation and helped raise the money. When families needed help, I was the first one there. At 28, I met Sarah at a church picnic. She was 25, with auburn hair and a laugh that made everyone around her smile. She played piano for the Sunday service and taught kindergarten at the Christian school next door. We dated for a year, and Pastor Morrison married us in a ceremony that felt like a benediction on my new life. We were blessed with 2 children, Daniel and Rebecca. I led family devotions every morning, read them Bible stories at night, and made sure they never missed Sunday school. We hosted Bible studies in our home, volunteered at the soup kitchen, and gave beyond our tithe. When the church needed something, we were there. When Pastor Morrison called, we answered. I watched my children grow up in that church. Daniel gave his first testimony in the youth group when he was 14, tears streaming down his face as he talked about accepting Christ. Rebecca sang her first solo when she was 12, her clear voice filling the sanctuary with amazing grace. These were the moments I had prayed for during those long nights when they were babies, when I had asked God to protect them, to guide them, to make them mighty warriors for His kingdom. Sarah and I celebrated our 20th anniversary with a renewal of vows at Grace Community. Pastor Morrison, now in his 50s with silver threading through his hair, smiled at us and said, "You two are the backbone of this church. Your faithfulness is an example to us all." By then, I had been teaching Sunday school for 15 years, serving as a deacon for 12, and managing the church finances for almost 2 decades. I knew every family, every struggle, every triumph. When Tom Henderson lost his job, I helped him find work at my company. When the Martinez family's house burned down, I coordinated housing and collected donations. When young couples needed marriage counseling, Pastor Morrison would often ask me to meet with them first, to share from my years of experience. I poured myself into that church. My time, my energy, my resources, everything I had belonged to God, and I expressed that through service to Grace Community. There were seasons when I worked 60 hours at my job and then spent another 20 at the church. Sarah sometimes gently suggested I slow down, but I couldn't. How could I? God had saved me, given me a family, blessed me beyond measure. This was my offering, my worship, my way of saying thank you for rescuing a broken young man who had cried out in the darkness 40 years ago. The church grew over those decades. From 200 members when I first walked through the doors, to over 800 by the time my children were in high school. We built a new sanctuary, added an education wing, and started programs for everything from addiction recovery to senior care. And through it all, I was there. Planning, serving, giving, loving. Daniel graduated from seminary when he was 26 and took a position as a youth pastor in Philadelphia. Rebecca married a missionary and moved to Guatemala. Sarah and I became empty nesters, but our lives remained full. We had the church, we had each other, and we had a lifetime of memories built within those walls. I thought I knew everyone at Grace Community. I thought I understood the heart of our congregation. But as Pastor Morrison approached retirement and began introducing his successor, I started to notice changes. Pastor Robert Chen was 42, dynamic, and filled with new ideas. He had a master's degree from a prestigious seminary and had led a church in California to triple its membership. He talked about vision, about reaching the next generation, about being relevant in a changing world. The younger families loved him. His sermons were engaging, peppered with movie references and contemporary examples. He brought in a new worship team that played modern music with drums and electric guitars. I tried to embrace the changes. I really did. But something felt off. The new worship style seemed more like a concert than a worship service. The sermons, while entertaining, felt light on scripture and heavy on pop psychology. And Pastor Chen's vision for the church seemed to prioritize growth and relevance over depth and discipleship. Still, I kept my concerns to myself. Who was I to question the new pastor? Perhaps I was just being old-fashioned, resistant to change. Sarah noticed my discomfort but encouraged me to give Pastor Chen time. Change is hard, she said, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. 6 months after Pastor Chen took over, he called a meeting with all the church leaders. He unveiled his vision for restructuring the church's governance. The board of deacons would be replaced with a team of elders that he would personally select. The church finances would be managed by a professional accounting firm rather than volunteers. Many of the long-standing programs would be reimagined or discontinued to make room for new initiatives. I raised my hand. Pastor Chen, some of these programs have been serving our community for decades. Before we discontinue them, shouldn't we evaluate their effectiveness and get input from those they serve? Pastor Chen smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Marco, I appreciate your long history with this church, but we need to stop living in the past. The world is changing, and we need to change with it. Trust me, I've seen this work in other churches. Something twisted in my stomach, but I nodded and said nothing more. Over the following months, everything I had helped build began to disappear. The addiction recovery program, which had helped over 300 people find freedom over the past 15 years, was canceled because it didn't align with the new church vision. The mission trips I had organized for nearly 20 years were replaced with short-term service experiences that cost 3 times as much and accomplished a fraction of the work. The soup kitchen where we had served the homeless every Saturday morning was shut down because Pastor Chan felt it attracted the wrong element to the church property. I watched families leave the church, confused and hurt. I received calls from people I had discipled for years, asking me what was happening. I didn't know what to tell them. I brought my concerns to Pastor Chen multiple times, always respectfully, always privately, as Scripture instructed. Each time, he dismissed me with a patronizing smile and a comment about old guard resistance to progress. The final straw came when I received a letter informing me that my services managing the church finances were no longer needed. The letter was polite but impersonal, thanking me for my years of service but explaining that the church was moving in a new direction with professional financial management. I had managed those finances faithfully for 22 years. I had never taken a penny, never made a single questionable decision. Every transaction was documented, every dollar accounted for. And now I was being dismissed with a form letter. I requested a meeting with Pastor Chen. He kept me waiting in his office for 30 minutes, then breezed in with his phone in his hand, clearly distracted. "Marco, I'm glad you came by. I wanted to talk to you anyway." "Pastor, I received the letter about the finances. After 22 years, I thought I deserved at least a conversation before being let go." He sat down behind his desk, his expression serious. "Marco, I'm going to be direct with you. You've been a faithful servant to this church, and no one can take that away from you. But it's time for you to step back and let the next generation lead. You've had your season. Now it's someone else's turn." "Step back from what? I'm still able to serve. You're still living in 1985, he interrupted. "This church needs to move forward, and frankly, you're standing in the way." I sat there, stunned. Standing in the way. "Pastor, everything I've done has been for the good of this church, for the glory of God." "I'm sure you believe that. But your vision of church, your way of doing things, it's outdated. Young families don't want the kind of programs you're pushing. They want excellence, professionalism, relevance. They want a church that looks like the world they live in, not some relic from decades ago." "But the gospel doesn't change. Truth doesn't change. Shouldn't we?" "The gospel doesn't change, but methods do. And if we don't adapt, we'll die. I've seen it happen to too many churches. I won't let it happen here." He stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. "Take some time, Marco. Step back from your duties. Enjoy your life. You've earned a rest." I walked out of his office feeling like I had been punched in the stomach. Sarah found me sitting in my car in the parking lot an hour later, staring at nothing. "What happened?" she asked gently. I told her everything. She held my hand and cried with me. "Maybe he's right," she finally said. "Maybe it is time to step back. We could travel, spend more time with the grandkids. You've given so much for so long. Maybe God is releasing you to a different season." I wanted to believe her. But something about the way Pastor Chan had spoken to me, the dismissiveness in his tone, the way he had reduced 4 decades of faithful service to being in the way, it felt wrong. It felt like betrayal. But what could I do? He was the pastor. He had the support of the board and the younger families. I was just one man, one older man who lived in 1985. I tried to step back. I stopped volunteering for everything. I sat in the service on Sundays and went home. I didn't attend Bible study or serve on Saturdays. I tried to be okay with it. But Grace Community had been my life for 40 years. Without it, I felt lost. I would drive by the church on weekdays and see new people coming and going, people I didn't know, programs I had never heard of. It was like watching your home be occupied by strangers. 3 months later, I received a call from David Patterson, a man I had mentored for over a decade. He sounded distressed. "Marco, I need to talk to you. Can we meet?" We met at a coffee shop, and David looked terrible, exhausted, worried, almost frightened. "What's wrong?" I asked. He pulled out his phone and showed me a document. It was a financial statement from the church. I scanned it quickly, and my blood ran cold. Large sums of money were being transferred to accounts I didn't recognize. Expenses were being listed for programs that I knew didn't exist. The numbers didn't add up. As someone who had managed those finances for over 2 decades, I could see immediately that something was very wrong. "Where did you get this?" I asked. "I'm on the new finance committee." I started asking questions because some things didn't make sense. "Marco, I think someone is embezzling from the church. A lot of money. Over the past 8 months, nearly $200,000 has disappeared." I felt sick. "Have you brought this to Pastor Chen?" I tried. He told me I was mistaken, that I didn't understand the new accounting system. "But Marco, I'm an accountant. This is what I do for a living. These aren't accounting differences. This is fraud. What do you want me to do? You know these finances better than anyone. You know the systems, the history. I need you to look at this and tell me if I'm crazy." I took the documents home and spent the entire night going through them. By morning, I had filled a legal pad with notes and discrepancies. David wasn't crazy. Someone was stealing from the church, and they were doing it systematically, deliberately, and with considerable sophistication. The question was who? The only people with access to these accounts were Pastor Chen and the professional accounting firm he had hired. I prayed for guidance. I didn't want to believe that Pastor Chen would steal from the church. But the evidence was there, clear and damning. I decided to go to the church board first, to present the evidence and let them investigate. Surely they would want to get to the bottom of this. Surely they would protect the church. I requested an emergency board meeting. They agreed, though I could hear the reluctance in the board chairman's voice. The meeting was held on a Tuesday evening. I arrived with 3 folders full of documentation, ready to present my findings. But when I walked into the conference room, Pastor Chen was sitting at the head of the table, smiling. "Marco, thank you for coming. The board asked me to sit in on this meeting since you indicated it was a financial matter." I hesitated. This wasn't what I had planned. But the board members were looking at me expectantly, so I proceeded. I laid out everything. The missing money, the false expenses, the transfers to unknown accounts. I showed them the documentation, walked them through the discrepancies, and explained why this couldn't be simple accounting errors. When I finished, there was silence. Then Pastor Chen spoke. "Marco, I appreciate your diligence, but you're misunderstanding what you're seeing. These are legitimate expenses for new ministry initiatives. The accounting firm has assured me that everything is in order. Pastor, I've been doing this for 22 years. These aren't legitimate expenses. These are." "You've been away from the finances for 3 months now," he interrupted. "Things have changed. The way we account for things has changed. You're looking at a new system and trying to apply old standards. It doesn't work that way." I turned to the board members. "Please, I'm asking you to bring in an independent auditor, just to verify. If everything is legitimate, then great. But if it's not..." The board chairman, a man named Gerald Winters whom I had known for 15 years, cleared his throat. "Marco, we trust Pastor Chen. He's brought tremendous growth to this church. We're not going to undermine his leadership by implying we don't trust him with an audit. This isn't about trust. This is about stewardship. We have a responsibility to the congregation." "We have a responsibility to support our pastor," Gerald interrupted. "And frankly, Marco, your attitude has been concerning. You've been resistant to change from the beginning. You've questioned Pastor Chen's decisions repeatedly. And now you're making serious accusations without any real evidence." "Without evidence? I just showed you. You showed us accounting documents that you admittedly don't fully understand because the system has changed. Marco, I'm going to be direct with you. Your time of leadership in this church is over. You need to accept that and move on." I looked around the table at men I had served with for years, men I had prayed with and worked beside. Not one of them would meet my eyes. "So you're not going to investigate? You're not going to do anything?" "There's nothing to investigate," Pastor Chen said smoothly. "But I am concerned about you, Marco. This obsession with the past, this inability to accept change, it's not healthy. Maybe you should consider taking some time away from the church entirely, for your own well-being." I gathered my folders and stood up. I've given 40 years to this church. 40 years of faithful service. And you're telling me to go away because I'm asking questions about missing money. "We're telling you to go away because you're causing division," Gerald said. "The Bible is clear about how to handle divisive people." I walked out of that meeting in a daze. They had turned it around on me. Somehow, I had become the problem. I told Sarah everything that night. She was furious on my behalf, but also frightened. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I don't know. But I can't just let this go. If someone is stealing from the church, the congregation has a right to know." "Marco, be careful. These men have power. If you push this, then what? What can they do to me that's worse than watching the church I love be destroyed? I decided to go directly to the congregation. I wrote a detailed letter outlining my concerns and the evidence I had found. I printed 300 copies and planned to distribute them at the Sunday service. But on Saturday night, I received a call from Pastor Chen. "Marco, I heard about your letter. Don't do this. Someone needs to tell the truth." "The truth?" "You're about to destroy this church with false accusations. You're about to ruin lives, including your own. If the accusations are false, then let's have an independent audit. Prove me wrong." There was a long pause. Then Pastor Chen's voice changed, becoming cold and hard. "If you distribute that letter tomorrow, I will stand in front of the congregation and tell them exactly what kind of man you are. I will tell them about the anger issues, the control problems, the inability to accept leadership. I will tell them that you've been asked repeatedly to step back and have refused. I will tell them that you're unstable and need help. And they will believe me, Marco, because I'm their pastor and you're just a bitter old man who can't let go." That's not true. None of that is true. Truth is whatever people believe. And I'm very good at helping people believe what I need them to believe. He hung up. I sat there holding the phone, shaking. Sarah had been listening. "He's threatening you," she whispered. "He's threatening to destroy my reputation. What are you going to do?" I looked at the stack of letters on my desk. I thought about standing in front of the congregation, my church family for 40 years, and having Pastor Chen tell them I was unstable, angry, controlling. I thought about my children hearing those accusations, my grandchildren being told their grandfather had lost his mind. And I made a decision that I would regret for the rest of my life. I burned the letters. I told myself it was wisdom, that I was choosing peace over division. But the truth was, I was afraid. Afraid of losing my reputation, my standing, the respect of people I had served for decades. I was afraid that Pastor Chen was right, that they would believe him over me. So I said nothing. I went to church on Sunday and sat in my pew and kept silent. But David Patterson didn't. He stood up during the announcement time and asked publicly for an independent audit of the church finances. The sanctuary went silent. Pastor Chen's face hardened. "David, this isn't the time or place for this discussion. If you have concerns, let's meet privately." "I've tried to meet privately. You dismissed me. I'm asking now, in front of the whole church, for an independent audit. If there's nothing wrong, it should be easy to prove. What you're asking for is expensive and unnecessary. It shows a lack of trust in leadership, and the Bible is clear about respecting those who lead us. The Bible is also clear about stewardship and integrity. I'm not questioning your leadership. I'm asking for transparency." I could see Pastor Chen calculating his response. Then he smiled sadly. "David, I know you've been under a lot of stress lately. I know your business has been struggling and your marriage has been difficult. Sometimes when we're going through hard times, we project our struggles onto others. I think that's what's happening here. Why don't you come to my office this week and let's talk about what's really bothering you?" It was masterful. In 30 seconds, Pastor Chen had made David look unstable, dismissed his concerns as projection, and taken the moral high ground by offering counseling. The congregation was nodding sympathetically. David looked around, realized he had lost, and sat down. After the service, I found him in the parking lot. He was sitting in his car, crying. "You didn't back me up," he said when he saw me. "I stood up there alone, and you just sat there." "I'm sorry. I was afraid." "We're all afraid, Marco. But somebody has to be willing to risk something for what's right." He drove away, and I never saw him in church again. Weeks passed. I went through the motions of life, but something inside me had broken. I had failed. I had been given an opportunity to stand for truth, and I had chosen silence out of fear. The church continued to change. More of the old programs were discontinued. More long-time members left quietly. The congregation was growing, but it was growing with new people who had no history, No connection to what Grace Community had been. Sarah noticed my depression. "You need to talk to someone," she said. "This is eating you alive." "I failed," I told her. "When it mattered most, I failed. You did what you thought was right at the time. You can't torture yourself over it." But I could, and I did. Then, on a Tuesday morning, I received a call from the FBI. "Is this Marco Stevenson?" "Yes." "Mr. Stevenson, this is Special Agent Williams. We need to speak with you about Grace Community Church. Can you come to our office this afternoon?" My hands went numb. "What is this about?" "We'd rather discuss it in person. Are you available at 2 o'clock? I agreed and spent the next 3 hours terrified. What did the FBI want with me? Had Pastor Chen carried through on his threat, accused me of something? At the FBI office, I was led to a conference room where 2 agents waited. They were professional but not unkind. "Mr. Stevenson, we're investigating financial irregularities at Grace Community Church. We understand you managed the church finances for over 20 years. Relief flooded through me. They weren't investigating me, they were investigating the church. Yes, I did. Until about 4 months ago. Why did you stop? I told them everything. The new pastor, the changes, my concerns about the finances, the board meeting, David Patterson's public request for an audit, and my own cowardice in backing down. They listened carefully, taking notes. When I finished, Agent Williams leaned forward. "Mr. Stevenson, do you still have copies of the financial documents you analyzed?" "Yes, I have everything." "We'll need those. What you've described matches exactly what we've been seeing. Pastor Chen has been under investigation for nearly 6 months. He did the same thing at his previous church in California. Took over, made rapid changes, marginalized long-time members, and embezzled nearly $500,000 before anyone caught on. I felt like I had been punched. $500,000. He's sophisticated. He knows how to manipulate accounting systems and, more importantly, how to manipulate people. The people who question him are isolated, discredited, and eventually driven out. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, he's already moved on. Why didn't someone warn us? Why didn't the church in California? They were embarrassed. They settled with him quietly, made him sign a non-disclosure agreement, and let him leave with a good recommendation. They thought they were protecting the church's reputation. Instead, they enabled him to do it again. How much has he taken from Grace Community? We think around $350,000 so far. I closed my eyes. $350,000. Money that had been given by faithful people to serve God, to help others, to advance the gospel. Money that had been stolen by a man they trusted, a man who stood in the pulpit every Sunday and spoke about integrity and faith. What happens now? I asked. We'll finish our investigation and bring charges. We'll need your testimony and your documents. And we'll need you to be prepared. This is going to be difficult. Pastor Chen will fight back, and he'll use every weapon he has. They were right. 2 weeks later, FBI agents arrived at the church during a Sunday service and arrested Pastor Chen. The congregation was in shock. Within hours, the story was all over the news. And within a day, Pastor Chen's attorney released a statement claiming that the church's former financial manager, Me, had been embezzling money for years, and that Pastor Chen had discovered it and was in the process of reporting it when he was falsely arrested. My phone rang constantly. Friends, family, church members, all wanting to know if it was true. Had I been stealing from the church? The FBI released a statement confirming that I was not a suspect and was, in fact, cooperating with their investigation. But the damage was done. Half the congregation believed Pastor Chen's accusation. The other half didn't know what to believe. Sarah and I stopped attending services. We couldn't walk into that building and face the stares, the whispers, the accusations. The church that had been our home for 40 years was now a place of pain. David Patterson called me. "I'm sorry, Marco. I'm so sorry for what you're going through. You tried to warn them. I should have stood with you. We both did what we could. Sometimes that's not enough. The trial took 6 months. I testified about the financial irregularities I had found, the board meeting where my concerns were dismissed, and the threat Pastor Chen had made. Other members of his previous church testified about similar patterns. The evidence was overwhelming. Pastor Chen was convicted of wire fraud, money laundering, and theft. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. But the damage to Grace Community was done. The congregation split. Some members left to start a new church. Others scattered to different congregations. Those who remained were hurt, angry, and struggling to rebuild trust. The board asked me to come back, to help restore the finances and rebuild the church. I said no. You didn't believe me when I brought you evidence, I told Gerald Winters. You called me divisive and told me to leave. You chose to protect a criminal instead of protecting the church. Why would I help you now? We were wrong, he admitted. We were foolish and blind. But the church needs you, Marco. The people need you. The church needed me 6 months ago. Now it's too late. Sarah and I visited different churches for several months but couldn't find a home. Everything felt wrong. We had spent 40 years at Grace Community. We had poured our lives into that place. And now it was gone. Not the building, but what it had been, what it had meant. A year after the trial, we received an invitation to a special service at Grace Community. The congregation wanted to honor me, to apologize publicly for how I had been treated, and to ask for my forgiveness. I didn't want to go. The wounds were still too fresh, the betrayal too deep. But Sarah convinced me. You need closure, she said. We both do. So on a Sunday morning, exactly 18 months after the day I had sat in the third pew and watched everything fall apart, I walked back into Grace Community Church. The building was the same, but everything else had changed. There were maybe 200 people in the sanctuary, a fraction of what it had been at its peak. Many faces I didn't recognize. Many I had expected to see were gone. The new pastor, a kind older man named Thomas Reed, welcomed me warmly. Mr. Stevenson, thank you for coming. This means more than you know. During the service, Pastor Reed spoke about the importance of listening to prophetic voices, even when they tell us things we don't want to hear. He talked about the cost of leadership and the courage it takes to stand for truth when everyone else is silent. Then he invited me to the front. I walked up slowly, feeling hundreds of eyes on me. Pastor Reed handed me a plaque, a recognition of my 40 years of service. But more than that, he handed me a letter, signed by over 100 members of the congregation, apologizing for not believing me, for not standing with me, for choosing comfort over courage. I stood there, holding the letter, and felt tears streaming down my face. This was what I had wanted, to be vindicated, to be recognized, to have people acknowledge that I had been right. But it felt hollow, because the cost had been too high. The church I loved was shattered. Families had been hurt. Faith had been damaged. And no amount of recognition or apology could undo that. Pastor Reed spoke again. Marco, we want to honor you today. We want to tell you that you belong here. You have always belonged here. And we're sorry it took us so long to see it. I opened my mouth to thank him, to accept the apology graciously, to say something about forgiveness and moving forward. But different words came out. I need to tell you something, I said, my voice shaking. Something I've never told anyone. The sanctuary went silent. The night before David Patterson stood up and asked for an audit, Pastor Chan called me. He told me that if I said anything publicly, he would destroy my reputation. He threatened me. And I backed down. I had letters printed, 300 of them, outlining everything I had found. And I burned them. I chose my reputation over truth. I chose safety over courage. I looked out at the congregation, many of whom were crying. David stood up alone because I was too afraid to stand with him. And then I watched him be humiliated and dismissed, and I did nothing. I let him think he was crazy. I let him suffer alone, because I was afraid. My voice broke. You're apologizing to me, but I'm the one who needs to apologize. Not to you, but to David. To everyone who left this church because they knew something was wrong but couldn't get anyone to listen. To everyone who was hurt because I chose silence when I should have spoken. The tears were flowing freely now. I served God for 40 years in this church. But when it mattered most, when the church needed someone to stand in the gap, I failed. I was a coward. And people paid the price for my cowardice. I looked at Pastor Reed. "You're wrong, Pastor. I don't belong here. Not because you don't want me, but because I don't deserve to be here. I had one job, to be faithful, and when the test came, I failed." I handed the plaque back to him and walked toward the door. But before I could leave, someone stood up. It was David Patterson. "Marco, wait." I turned, surprised. I hadn't known he was there. He walked to the front and stood beside me. "You think you're the only one who failed?" he asked quietly. "You think you're the only one who was afraid?" He turned to address the congregation. After I stood up that day and was dismissed, I left this church. I told myself it was because they didn't want truth. But the real reason was that I couldn't face the shame. I couldn't face the judgment in people's eyes. I ran away instead of fighting. I told myself I was being wise, but I was just being scared. He looked at me. "You're not the only coward, Marco. We're all cowards. Every single person in this room has chosen safety over truth at some point. We've all looked the other way. We've all been silent when we should have spoken." He picked up the plaque Pastor Reed was holding and pressed it into my hands. But that's not the end of the story. Because God doesn't give up on cowards. He doesn't throw away people who fail. If he did, there wouldn't be anyone left. David's voice grew stronger. "You think you don't belong here? You think one failure erases 40 years of faithfulness? You think one moment of fear cancels out 4 decades of service? That's not how grace works, Marco. That's not how God works." He gestured to the congregation. "Every person here has been broken by what happened. Every person here has had to confront their own failure to see, to question, to stand. We all bear responsibility. But we're still here, trying to rebuild, trying to do better." He put his hand on my shoulder. "You belong here because we all belong here. Broken, imperfect, fallen people who are trying to follow a God who specializes in redemption. You belong here because Grace Community isn't about being perfect. It's about being faithful, even when we fail. Even when we're afraid. Even when we get it wrong." I looked at David, this man I had failed, and saw nothing but compassion in his eyes. "I don't know if I can forgive myself," I whispered. "Then let us forgive you," he said simply. "Let God forgive you. And maybe, eventually, you'll be able to forgive yourself." The congregation stood. One by one, they came forward. People I had served with for decades, people I had hurt with my silence, people who had been hurt by the fallout. They hugged me, cried with me, told me they were sorry and that they forgave me and that they needed me. Sarah was there, her arms around me, whispering, "This is your home. This is your family. You belong here." And standing in that broken church, surrounded by broken people, I finally understood what grace meant. Not that we deserve it. Not that we earn it. But that God gives it anyway, to cowards and failures, to people who get it wrong, to sinners who need a Savior. I had served God for 40 years. I had taught Sunday school and managed finances and led mission trips. I had done everything I thought God wanted me to do. But in that moment, broken and forgiven, I realized that all of it, all 40 years, had been preparation for this. To learn that faithfulness isn't about being perfect. It's about getting back up when you fall. It's about accepting grace when you don't deserve it. It's about belonging to a community that sees your worst failures and loves you anyway. Pastor Chen had told me I didn't belong. And in a way, he was right. I didn't belong in a church that valued appearance over truth, growth over depth, success over integrity. But I did belong here, in this smaller, humbler, wounded community that was learning what it meant to be the church. Not a show or a performance, but a family of broken people following a God who makes beautiful things out of our failures. I am Marco Stevenson. I am 63 years old. I am a coward who let fear silence his voice. I am a failure who chose safety over courage. And I am loved. I am forgiven. I belong. Not because I earned it, but because grace is a gift we could never earn. That is my story. That is the truth I carried for 40 years without knowing it. That is the lesson I learned, not from my faithfulness, but from my failure. And perhaps that's the greatest gift God could have given me, to strip away everything I thought made me worthy, so I could finally understand that I never was. None of us are. We're all just beggars showing other beggars where to find bread. And here, in this broken church filled with broken people, we've finally learned where to look. Not to our own righteousness or our years of service or our faithfulness or our courage, but to a God who loves cowards enough to die for them. That's the story. That's the truth. And now, finally, after 40 years, I understand what it means to belong.